Today is Wednesday, December 27th, 2023, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. I'm here once again with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. How are we doing today, Mr. Smith?
Doing really well. It's a busy post-Charlotte family weekend. In fact, this will air sometime after, just so you know, we're recording these in advance. So the Charlotte family weekend just finished, and it's pleasantly busy catching up on some of the stuff we were doing, preparing for this weekend. We're going to be going out of town to speak somewhere. So anyways, probably more than you want to know, but doing really well, Mr. Robinson. How are you? I know you've had some really burdensome house guests, is my understanding. It's been pretty difficult.
Oh yeah, we can't wait for them to leave. This is our fourth podcast in 5 days, I think.
I think it is. We've never recorded this many in this tight amount of time, right?
Well, taking advantage of so many people coming into town for the Charlotte Family Weekend, we take that opportunity to grab guests that we know will be fun and interesting. And our guest today is somebody we have had on the podcast before. Would do 2 other podcasts, or I think 2.
I think 2 or 3. You did at least 1 or 2 or so. That one time Mr. Robinson was under the weather, and then we did at least 1 or 2 together. Boy, I don't know. I'll have to take a look. By the way, and I should highlight, Mr. Robinson really doesn't hate his guests normally. Our guest today is staying at Mr. Robinson's house. That's why we could get away with something like that.
Our guest today is, I don't know, would you consider yourself a historian? Or like even by trade, somewhat by virtue of your
degree,
your degree and everything.
That's the question. If we're going to base it off of what I did in school, I guess you could say I certainly got a bachelor's degree in history, so I know that, and was also taking some graduate level classes, but never quite finished the master's degree. I got about 2/3 of the way there, but then situations changed, and it just no longer made financial sense to continue to pursue that.
Well, Mr. Sandor, you can sit at this table, but we do not grant you the rank of master.
I understand. I like historical fiction. I'm reading one of those books right now, as well as real history. So for people who are like, I just can't wait to read about, at this point, the collapse of the late Bronze Age, that makes me a bit of a history nerd at very least. But sure, whether you want to say historian or not, well, there's probably many that would be more professionally qualified than I am.
Well, please tell me you got the episode 3 reference, or I'm going to feel terrible, because that was a weird thing to say if you didn't. The Anakin reference?
Well, no, yeah.
Oh, good.
That was
good.
your best Samuel L. Jackson voice, I assume.
Yeah, if so, that would be pretty terrible. Well, we haven't actually said it officially yet. We have Mr. Mark Sandor at the table with us.
Pastor out in Wisconsin. How many church areas do you have?
There's 3 congregations that I pastor full-time in Minneapolis, Merrill, Wisconsin Dells, and then I'm also helping Mr. Pommichter in the new one in Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
Wow, okay.
That sounds like cold states.
And certainly in December, you wouldn't be wrong. But
well, he has come across some information that really prompt his interest and our interest, and we've been talking about it. It's historical in nature, and so we are going to address today on the podcast: is the British Empire the worst empire ever? We'll take a look. So, cue the music. Welcome back, and it is good to be here with Mr. Mark Sandor. It's so nice. It's kind of like the feast, these Charlotte family weekends, in that you get to see everybody, but it's often across a room or something. And of course, the Robinsons have the Sandors over, and I've been able to spend some time with Mr. Sandor because I went to go get my wife a coffee while she was manning the crafts sales. And anyway, Mr. Sandor kindly wanted to jump in the car with me, so we got to drive to get coffee and come back. And so I really appreciated that. Thank you, Mr. Sandor, for being willing to. He left his children unobserved, uncared for. I'm just kidding. He actually dropped them off with his wife and jumped in the car with me, and it was nice to spend time together because you live a lot further away than you used to. We don't get to spend as much time together.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's probably about 5 times as far away or something.
It is very far. And so we're just appreciative that you don't mind while you're in town letting us take some time with you, and love having you on the podcast. It's been a long time. And the poll that you mentioned really did get our attention. And I don't want to preview too much. I'd rather save my exclamation marks for after it's discussed. But why don't you just kind of take over today? Why don't you just let us know what was it you came across and what are your thoughts and what are we going to talk about today?
Sure. Well, and as we're kind of considering topics and things that we might be able to cover in a podcast, I do enjoy studying history, and even just the idea of sitting down with some friends and talking about history for an hour with some coffee and other stuff. I was like, this is going to be a really nice morning. And but trying to find the right topic for it, and I will give my wife some credit because my wife even mentioned, well, maybe you should talk about the British Empire. And I thought, well, that is a huge topic. You're talking about something that the statement is even that the sun never set on the British Empire. That whether you want to talk about it in terms of time frame or talk about it in terms of geography, was just a massive empire and a relatively recent one. But to try to narrow it down, one of the things I found on YouTube is, since I follow random history stuff on YouTube, was a poll that was posted one time that just asked the question, what is the worst empire in history? And they gave you 4 options. The options on this particular poll were the Russians, the Spanish, the Mongols, and the British. So those are your 4 options that you could have clicked on for this particular YouTube poll. The Russians, the Spanish, the Mongols, and the British. Now, again, being the history nerd, I almost looked at that poll and I immediately thought, well, wait a minute, we are missing some likely candidates on this particular list for the worst empire in history. I know Mr. Robinson and I sometimes listen to similar podcasts, and so, Mr. Robinson, if I was to just ask you that question, whether you wanted to go with one of those 4 options or a different one, who would you put on the list as being top 2 or 3 worst empire in history?
Well, the one I would consider the worst is not on here. I would also argue that not including the Roman Empire is a notable oversight. That's just off the top. What's funny is my conclusion, because I know you're about to get to see how the poll results went, was that clearly history is not being taught in the schools anymore. But I mean, my rank number 1 worst empire of all time is the Assyrians, hands down.
Sure.
Well, the Russians also have given them a pretty good run in their own way, particularly with the start of the Bolshevik Revolution. They were absolutely brutal to Ukraine, Poland. I actually drew the conclusion that you'd rather be captured by the Germans than the Russians during the 20s, 30s, into the war.
I think there's a fair number of Polish who at the beginning of World War II agreed that they were far. If you're going to lose the war and you're going to be captured by someone, they would have leaned towards taking their chances with Hitler and the Nazis. Which, again, what a horrible would you rather question that's out there. But that's kind of one of the questions we'll come back to today. Mr. Smith, do you have any worst empires that you think of?
Oh boy, let's see. I have a few thoughts, concerning the Germans. I do find that interesting what you just said. When my wife and I were in Germany and we were looking at their equivalent on the eastern side of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. It's not quite that, but it's actually dedicated to Russian soldiers that came to supposedly liberate, but the guide told us that actually in Germany they call it the Tomb of the Unknown Rapist because the Russian soldiers were so brutal when they came in. History is not as much my thing. You said you were excited coming and knowing you could sit down with your friends and talk about history. Am I ever going to have that day we sit down and talk about math, with some friends? I don't know that's ever really going to happen. It's easy, you tempted me earlier as we were chatting about the podcast. I could say the Galactic Empire, is pretty brutal. You have Emperor Palpatine blowing up entire planets. At the same time, maybe a planet blowing up is a relatively merciful death. I don't really know, but it's considered very brutal. But in terms of real life empires, it'd be tempted to just look at the ones I know, and the Assyrians in particular were so absolutely brutal. We struggle. We talked even a little bit before the podcast in putting the booklet together and in trying to talk about the Germany booklet, that is, Germany in Prophecy, just how atrocious they were, that you can't actually describe some of the things they did because your listeners won't even be able to think about anything else anymore because they'll think about how horrible these things. So part of me thought the question could depend on, well, what does it mean to be the worst? Does it mean to be the least orderly, the most chaotic, the most that just was constantly in the midst of warfare, or was it just the brutality towards its people? And I say, well, towards its people, I'm thinking, because that would be a pretty rough empire. And given my historical knowledge, among that group, I have no idea. Part of me wants to say the Mongols, only because there's at least a standout figure in that I can think about in terms of his brutality and offspring generation. Actually, it's not the same as brutality, but Genghis Khan in that regard. But I have to admit, I don't know. But if I had to pick those, and I'm just gambling, we don't encourage gambling. Don't gamble; it's wrong. But if we were, it's not money at stake, and I were just guessing, I would just say the Mongols, maybe.
Sure, and that actually was my choice of those particular options that were there. As Mr. Robinson pointed out, I remember looking at the poll and thinking, wait a minute, the British, the Mongols, the Russians, and the Spanish, we should have a list of maybe double that size, to get some of the others on there, like the Romans or Alexander the Great or the Syrians or so on.
Yeah, that was something I appreciate you just mentioned that again, because Mr. Robinson has talked about the culture of the ancient Greeks and some of those. And it's also hard to judge too, because some of their cultures, even you wouldn't think of it as what an empire would do, but just the culture of the people could be abhorrent, in terms of they have their slaves for this cause and that purpose. I won't go into details. So that's another thing that kind of made it hard to judge. Is it could be on the surface a really prosperous, quote unquote, peaceful empire, and yet the actual cultural standards within the empire might be particularly terrible. So I'm glad you said the Mongols. That makes me feel
sure.
Makes me feel
No,
good.
well, because I was kind of trying to think to myself almost like you said, what's the criteria? So in my own, it's just a YouTube poll. It's not to be taken overly seriously. But my specific criteria was almost what you mentioned, the idea of like, if I was on the opposite side of this empire, whether they had conquered me and I was frustrated by that, or they were the armies coming in, which one would I least want to be facing? And the Mongols kind of jumped out as being the main ones of all of those. But I thought, there's times in Russian history, especially like you mentioned with the Bolshevik Revolution and, certainly what's happened in the last century or so in Russia and the Soviet Union. The Spanish Empire, the things that Cortez was doing was pretty brutal as well. So you could make a pretty good case, I think, for some of these other ones. But I was kind of shocked. So here's actually the answer. The YouTube unscientific
So
poll
not the
answer.
reality answer
Right.
necessarily. Okay, YouTube's answer.
This is YouTube's answer. Was that by far and away, obviously, part of the reason this podcast title was Britain. Right? Britain got nearly half the votes. They got 46% of the votes. The Mongols were second, but they were kind of a distant second with 29%.
Wow.
Russia was down to 15%, which maybe means that people were not. I kind of wonder if they had said Soviet Union instead of Russia. Maybe we were thinking,
maybe.
Right, maybe pre-Soviet Union, you'd think, well, the Russians weren't any worse than anybody else. And then the Spanish were at 10%, or at least I haven't done the math to make sure that there might have been like a I don't know option, at the end if that did not quite add up to 100%. But I gave you 4 numbers. Did you add them all together?
I didn't add them
Okay,
all.
well, that's all right. But that was the only math part of this entire podcast. So Spain had 10%, but that kind of shocked me that the one on my list, which would have been by far and away the fourth of these 4 options, was instead the one that was by far and away the top option on YouTube. And so it was kind of what caused me to frame some of this particular podcast, because I think it does give us some interesting lessons, both about history as well as about some things that obviously will relate back to the scriptures, because the British Empire, we can go to some scriptures that are prophetic fulfillments that are displayed by the British Empire. But those are some of the ones that I kind of want to get into today. So if you want me to just take it away with the first point here?
That sounds great. And let me highlight to our listeners just real quickly, why is this important? You might think, oh, it's history. History is really boring, and only boring people are interested in history.
Whoa.
I'm just
okay,
kidding. I'm just kidding.
Shots
But
fired.
One of the main reasons is there's a whole world out there that is trying to program your brain to think exactly how this YouTube poll has turned out. There's cultural institutions, educational institutions. They are working hard to convince you that the British Empire, amongst certain other groups, were literally the worst empire in history. That's the last thing you would want. And so, if you're a teenager or young adult in our audience, this is relevant. Whenever this topic came up, it's like, yeah, it'd be great to do some deprogramming.
Well, without even doing a deep dive, when you first presented this to me, and then like, well, who are the other empires? Like the Spanish, for example, who were rated as the most benevolent apparently. Anybody heard of the Spanish Inquisition?
Right.
I mean, there was a reign of terror for quite a while. I've mentioned this on the podcast a couple times. I listened to a lengthy podcast that talked about the Spanish conquest of what we would consider modern day Mexico. And as the podcast host said, going into it, he said, listen, you can't think of this in terms of the good guys and the bad guys. This is the bad guys and the bad guys. The Aztecs were bad guys, and the Spanish came in and were equally as bad. And in fact, one of the ways you know that the Aztecs were bad dudes is other Mesoamericans fought on the side of the Spanish because they were so embittered towards how the Aztecs had treated them. Let's go to recent history. World War II. When the Germans were losing and they knew it was over, whose side did they run to? They didn't go to the Russian front. They wanted to get to where the Americans and the British were and surrender to them. And they were right, by the way. And so anyway, just right off the top, I think, how can anybody choose the British Empire? I know as we go through this, we're not going to try to paint them like they were some benevolent, ruling empire, but they were far, far from the most brutal. And I know we have some examples to go with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first main point, and again, this is just about studying history, and I think kind of going back to what Mr. Smith was just saying, the idea that sometimes there's agendas in history, and that is always awful to see. But one of the other things that can sometimes come up in history is that we are just very, very ignorant of it. Even when I was talking with my own children about it, and not that they've gone to college and gotten a degree in history or anything. They haven't had that opportunity yet, if that's even the path they choose. But a lot of times it's just ignorance. Like one of my sons said, well, from the American point of view, the British Empire, we had to kick them out in the Revolution, then yada, yada, yada for 150 years. And, oh, hey, now we're friends in World War II. It was like that was all he knew of the British Empire. And so for him, it's just a lack of exposure. But it was interesting talking with at least one man who was raised in Britain here in the Charlotte congregation. And he was bringing up that, yes, when he was raised in England, that the empire is presented as an evil thing practically, and that
really,
and I was kind of shocked when I was doing some Google searches that yes, a lot of them were like one article in particular was even arguing, how could you, if you're teaching about the British Empire, like how could you tell people to come up with a pros and cons list? They're like, you're just justifying colonization, you're justifying everything they did. And I thought, well, that is, you don't even want us to mention that they did anything halfway good for people. But so this kind of gets, I'm taking a while to get here, but the first main point is just a reminder of people that history is awful messy. In that, and it's especially messy when you get really selective about what a group of people have done. Hopefully, there's no perfect empire or kingdom throughout history. There's no one that we look back at in the 6,000 years. I believe one of the recent podcasts you did, a couple of them maybe, had mentioned that a traditional, that might have been the trad girl or trad wife or whatever,
okay.
but traditional is not the same as biblical. And going back to a certain age in history is not the same as getting back to a truly godly way of doing things. But sometimes you almost think, like, if, let's say we gave you the assignment, can you tell me something bad that King David did?
Right.
We could. And could we, if you only highlighted those things, which are accurate things that King David did wrong by breaking the commandments, you could almost make him sound really bad. And
King David, the adulterer, and murderer. And right.
And the irony is, who did it was his own son. I mean, Absalom was out there in Second Samuel, someplace where he was going and probably was telling accurate things about his dad to stir up rebellion against his dad, all the while ignoring, like, I can't imagine Absalom was out there being like, oh yeah, when my dad killed Goliath and and then he's defeated all of our enemies and all this other stuff, but he was probably highlighting, well, you came here for justice, but my dad couldn't even get my sister justice, and he, and then when I took care of business, I got kicked out. And of course, I mean, are you going to trust him? Your wife's kind of pretty. Don't introduce her to David. It's, I mean, all the things that he could have said in that situation to make David look horrible, and a lot of them might have been accurate. And yet we know God's overall thing is that David was a man after God's own heart. I think that's kind of one of the things we have to remember about sometimes when we're talking about history is that when we say that something was better in history, that does not mean perfect. And certainly when somebody wants, like if someone came up to you and said King David was the worst king of Israel, you'd almost think, well, that's crazy.
Right.
That'd be crazy to say that. If for nothing else, that when wow, I just had two names jump in my head. Who corrected David? Was it Nathan or Gad?
Nathan.
Oh, Nathan.
Nathan. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. I just wanted to clarify that, but rather than say it wrong.
Well, iron sharpens iron. You know,
There we go.
Sandor.
So Nathan comes in and corrects David, and David needs to be corrected. And the irony is he almost shows that he's a good king because he actually recognizes it and he repents at that time, where so many other kings would have been like, oh, all right, Nathan, here's a sword for you too, whatever, and just tried to silence anybody else who knew about it. It's kind of interesting when you're talking about these things to say that something was good or at least better is different than saying that it is perfect. One other thing I know about this particular point, and this might be another one to sort of jump in on, for you two to jump in, is the idea that it's sometimes very easy to look back and judge ancient peoples, or even not that ancient, by our modern standards. There's a lot of times where people want to look back and almost pretend if we had been alive at that point, we would have done it better, which is always a dangerous mindset to get into. I can only imagine, here's an example I've always thought of is, if you had Jonah's commission, right? God tells you to do something. Speaking of empires, right? Because Jonah is told to go to the Assyrian Empire, the one that we kind of even ranked as being potentially the worst one in history. Because as Mr. Smith mentioned, we can't describe everything they promoted themselves as. Like they carved it into stone, the horrible things they did to people that we don't care to even try to describe on this program. They were that bad, and Jonah's told, go preach to them so they'll repent. I could see myself kind of being like Jonah, right? I could see myself saying, okay, where's the ship to Tarshish here?
Yeah, let them burn. Let them all burn down, right?
Right.
Especially if he had a sense that this is the actual kingdom God would eventually use to correct his people all the more. Who'd want to think of your people having to suffer under the Assyrians? You'd say, no, I don't care what happens to them.
To support your point, I was reviewing some of my history notes, and the historian Dan Carlin, that we both listen to a lot, he said in a podcast I listened to recently that if Hitler had been a ruler in ancient Assyria, he wouldn't have even been remarkable enough to write about. So, and I was actually thinking about, not that we have to go too much of a deep dive on this, but even like the Greeks, which generally are viewed favorably, probably because of the philosophy and some of the calls for people to live a more what's the word you want to virtuous life, and that's laudable. But they so in fact the one podcast I listened to where the 13,000 Greeks get caught deep in Persian territory. I won't bother with the details, but like their plan to get back was they would just periodically attack a city and kill everybody and take everything in it. I mean, that of course that was just what you did. Apparently there was some kind of rule where when you surrounded a city, if they surrendered, then they kind of escaped with their life. But if they resisted you, then the army was allowed to kill them and take all their property. And so sometimes people were surrendering too much. And so then the soldiers would be, they're resisting us. And then they would butcher everybody and take everything. So,
interesting.
Yeah, it's the disconnect between what was considered just normal anciently and what we look at now is different.
Yeah, and I would say it can give kind of like, say, the opposite swing. It's easy to judge some things in the past from our modern perspective as if they were too harsh, when actually we're in the middle of an empire in decline, the American empire, and not recognizing that actually some of those actions in the past were taken to prevent what we're experiencing. I think, for example, if you actually took it out of the Bible and took some of the laws that God gave Israel to manage various things and to punish certain crimes, it'd be very easy for us to go, oh, that just seems so cruel. Like, say, stoning someone for fornication or adultery, right? And it's easy to think, oh, boy, that just sounds terrible. And so every once in a while we'll hear of modern cult, like Iran or some other theocracy, And if you actually look at theirs, things are actually not biblical how they handle it. I just want to, for the record, don't just lump all stonings or these things together. However, it's easy to think, man, that just sounds cruel. So just someone kind of gives in to temptation, or just, I know some who's committed adultery and they've been able to fix their lives. And of course, we appreciate forgiveness in Christ. I mean, especially with God's Spirit, a lot of things can be accomplished. But at the same time, yes, we're not that quote unquote cruel. But then if you look at the level of sexual perversion that exists in the United States today, and you look at how rampant, I mean, it used to be when I was at least a teenager, and they have a sitcom or television program where the teenagers are starting to be sexually promiscuous. You had the parents still just trying to help them find the right person or this, or they had this kind of talk, and boy, forget all that. It's just like no holds barred. Everything is open, all kinds of different quote unquote sexualities, because some of it's so far gone, I don't even know if that's what I would call it. And we're not even at the end of that process, right? We're just at the point where we're confused about what is a boy and what is a girl, and we don't understand any of that anymore. We don't understand. Nowadays, you got Canada, you can have up to 4 parents for one child on a form, and they do more than 4. It's just they had to pick something for the form, so you can go to the court and have 5 parents declared. We're in a state of moral chaos and rot that we haven't even seen the end of yet, but it's getting terrible. And so it's also hard to look back on some of those choices that a country might make and think, well, that seems cruel and harsh. Well, no, at the same time, it's easy to judge from where you are in history. You're warm, you're comfortable, you're happy, your air conditioning works, your refrigerator is stocked. But it's harder to see the larger perspective in judging these things, let alone in a carnal world where you're not relying on God and you've still got to manage peoples and far-flung pieces of an empire, et cetera. So it just seems like there's a lot of variables, and it's easy to make quick calls, and most everyone is just making these moral calls based on their own personal morality now and what they think of these empires in the past.
Right. And I think maybe the last thing I would want to say about this particular point, just about history being messy, and that when you look at different people or different cultures, can you find almost like one of the more modern themes in the United States is, what do we do with statues to people, and
Right.
It's like, can you find a reason to build a guy a statue? Probably. Can you find a reason to tear it down? Probably. And so you have to actually be able to look at, try to study it to get the full picture on things. I'm not sure if I want to give the exact thing. I know, Mr. Robinson, we were looking at a clip from a older British movie.
Yes.
I would think I'd maybe need disclaimer guy before I mention the exact thing, because it is not an endorsement of the movie.
Really? Well, tell you what, then we will definitely have disclaimer guy come out. And disclaimer guy, give us some perspective on some things we talk about.
Any discussion that follows should not be considered an endorsement of the subject of that discussion, unless the subject is the Bible. We endorse that big time.
Okay, good. We've been disclaimed. So the clip was from a group called Monty Python, and I think maybe that will be all I say about that. But it's an old British comedy series, and they were portraying. It was set in the Roman Empire in the Holy Land during the Roman Empire time, and one of the scenes had a group of discontent, Jews and locals there who had got together, and they were talking about how they needed to rebel against the Romans, and so the leader of the meeting just sits there and goes, "Yeah, and what have the Romans ever done for us?" And yells it out to his crowd, and sure enough, one of the guys kind of timidly raises his hands and says, "Well, the aqueduct. They built the aqueduct for us." And then he said, "Well, yeah, I guess they did do that." "Well, in sanitation." He's like, well, yes, they did that. And well, they built us roads. "Well, of course the roads go without saying with the Romans." And they roll through about like 6 or 7 or 8 things that the Romans had done for them. That, again, did that mean that the Romans were purely good guys and hadn't probably killed a lot of Jews on their invasion of the land and had kept things? But what I found kind of interesting was that, yes, even with the Romans, you could take a look and say, well, sure, you might not have wanted to be conquered, but almost like that article was trying to argue, you can't say there's positives and negatives. Well, even Monty Python was able to figure out that you could make a skit about it.
Well, in fact, I have in my show prep notes a very common historical critique on Rome. Rome creates a wasteland and called it peace. So they definitely were out there to conquer you, and if you rebelled, you paid the price. But at the same time, exactly the same thing. I read a book some time ago on the Roman conquest of England. And as I'm reading it, if you didn't mess with them, they probably let you go as long as you took care of business and paid them the appropriate taxes. And meanwhile, they right behind them the road guys come through and they're building them roads. And at the time, the British had never seen anything like a Roman road, and all these different things. To this day in England, you can go to the Bath, England. We need.
That was
guy.
That was a Roman colony. Yeah,
but I mean, there's still things left in many countries that the Romans built that are still in use, and that says something as well.
And that's, I mean, even them bringing up the aqueducts first. I mean, those were used for centuries, if not millennia, depending. As long as like an earthquake didn't knock them over, they built them so well. But anyway, the thing that's even kind of enjoyable about that Monty Python clip, or at least I say enjoyable, I think mildly educational, is it works for the Romans. And it could probably work for the British. What the British ever do for us? Well, they stopped infanticide, or they, they built roads, they built schools, they provided some of these other, kind of infrastructure things. Now, was it perfectly done? No, but you could probably list off a number of things. They could almost have that clip for it. What I'd be kind of curious about is, again, could you set that same Monty Python clip? What have the Romans ever done for us, or what have the British ever done for us? But what if you do throw the Assyrians in there? What have the Assyrians ever done for us? Well, if we look at what they carved on their walls,
and that was in
not much,
right? The quote unquote waiting room. So if you were a dignitary and you came to come talk to the Assyrian king, the waiting room had all the depictions of the very, very, very terrible things. I mean,
they wanted visiting kings to realize, here's what you're in the presence of, and here's what could happen to you.
Yes.
Wow.
This is such. If I can weigh in on a couple points that I had here in my notes. So here's an example, and your comment about David made me think of this as well. David did some things wrong, but then when faced with it, he acknowledged it and made some changes. So how long? When would you date the British Empire? How long was it running? But here I have a note. In 1660, they formed the Royal African Company. And I would actually say that the British in general with their empire was more business-oriented than even like conquering land. They just were trying to profit, and there were all these areas out there they could control. But anyway, and they did have the slave trade going, absolutely. But in the 1800s, we have an article in the January 2023 Tomorrow's World magazine called A Force for Change, that discusses how William Wilberforce expended personally his own fortune and his time, and it got like-minded friends together. Not only did they pass legislation through the Parliament that put an end to the slaves and slave trades, but they went actually out on the high seas and with the Royal Navy and fought against the others who were still in the slave trade to end the global slave trade. So did they do some wrong things? Yeah. But did they also do some incredible things that nobody did? Nobody. That's the thing that struck me going back last summer, listening to all these, it was particularly Dan Carlin's The King of Kings series, because he's going through probably, in fact, how do we have a poll that doesn't have the Greeks, the Persians, and the Romans in it? That's kind of amazing. And slavery was just, that was just the economics. That was just business. That was so for the British Empire to fight to end slavery, which really there'd be no financial benefit if you're just looking at it as savagely as possible. They fought to end it.
Right.
Name me another empire that fought to end slavery.
Right.
Except for the United States, which had its own internal civil war with slavery.
Yes. Yeah. It's again, and it's messy. That's the thing. That's the reason we're talking about this is, there are reasons to say something is good without endorsing everything about it, and that's the case. And the irony is, maybe if we actually knew more about Nineveh, or if we had the Assyrian side of the story, so to speak, although, as we've mentioned, they kind of left us their side. They carved it into walls, so we can actually sort of see their worldview.
So Dan Carlin said, well, you shouldn't take the Assyrians' treatment of their enemies personally, because it was just how they kept everybody in line. It wasn't personal, except that Dan Carlin points out that the king would have his throne set up so he could watch people have terrible things done to them.
Yes.
So there was some level of enjoyment in it. I've talked a lot, but I before we move on from this, I wouldn't mind mentioning some cultural change that the British brought to India in particular, which had some old habits that came to an end. Is this the best time?
Sure, by all means.
So I went and double checked that my recollection of this was correct, and there was a British commander-in-chief of the so the British East India Trade Company was in India, and they were definitely profiteers. I think Mr. Smith, you knew more about that than I did, but they also had some military over there, and British Commander Charles Napier enforced British prohibition against sati, which was the practice of burning widows on their husband's funeral pyre. Okay, so taken from, I won't say my source, Wikipedia. Okay, so even though they weren't doing it as much as they used to, this was like a Hindu practice, I think. He judged that this is the British commander, he judged that these immolations were motivated by profits for the priests. When told of an actual sati about to take place, he informed those involved that he would stop the sacrifice. The priest complained that this was a customary religious rite and that custom of a nation should be respected. As recounted by his brother William, he famously replied, "Be it so. This burning of widows is your custom. Prepare the funeral pyre. But my nation has also a custom. When men burn women alive, we hang them and confiscate all their property. My carpenters shall therefore erect gibbets," which is basically a type of gallows, "on which to hang all concerned when the widow is consumed. Let us all act according to national customs." And he really did end the practice. So, was there some brutality with the way the British ruled India? Absolutely. And I know from talking to a member in Kenya, they feel the same way. Yet at the same time, there were some benefits that like you said, it's a messy history.
It is. So getting into kind of the second main point, unless there's anything else on the first.
And I can summarize that as history is messy.
Yes.
Don't just think it's like, oh, this is a good guy and this is a bad guy, and that's the way it is. That history is messy.
Well, or to use Genesis 2, it's the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. Yeah. I mean, it's just whatever branch you happen to be studying, but it's going to be on that tree. It's not, you're not looking at any empire in history and be like, oh, They just nailed the tree of life.
They only ate the good fruit.
Right, and that is not the case. Right. So the second one, which is kind of related, but I do think it's hopefully have a little distinction to it, but it's the idea that history is not fair in how we remember people. That first off, for a lot of people, we have no memory of them. It will be in the resurrection that we get to know them. It will be at that point that we get to see them. But for even the people we do remember, for the facts and figures we have, so frequently we are operating with very small snippets of information about their life. The way Dan Carlin would put this point is, especially when you're talking about the best or worst empire or something like that, is he would say that history is graded on a curve. Empires can be maybe graded on a curve, where saying that the British were, a better empire than, let's say, Nazi Germany. Hopefully people would agree with that. But it's like, if you were saying that was better, well, in part that's because of how bad Nazi Germany was, that by its very nature, the British Empire would be in some ways better than that. But one of the things that I know I always am kind of struck by is when we think of people in the Bible, the amount that we know about them can be so slim. Again, if we just maybe leave the empires out of it, but focus on some just human beings in particular, the example I found fascinating was just with Rahab, where Rahab in the New Testament is recorded in a couple of places as being one of the heroes of faith. She shows up in I believe Hebrews 11, but certainly it's in James, where James is waxing eloquent about Abraham. And he switches over and talks about Rahab real quick, almost like, if you're going to think, well, who are two of the most faithful people in the Old Testament? Well, sure, Abraham. Yeah, he's the father of the faithful. Who's your second one? Well, Rahab. And it's like, really? That I'm not sure she would be the one who jumps out there. But then even there, what does he say about her? He's like, oh, yeah, it was Rahab the harlot. And I can only imagine when Rahab is, resurrected and comes back, and it was like, well, I was a great mom and wife after all that. I repented. I changed. I was in the lineage of Jesus Christ. Why?
Right.
Why couldn't I have been the Rahab the repentant or something like that? Rahab the overcomer or something. I could only imagine if someone took something from my early life, not being raised in the church, and if I was still known as, well, there's Sandor the pork eater. And it's like right. that was decades ago. That's not what I'm doing anymore. But Rahab kind of has that similar example, even in a good way, right? And then there's other people I know Mr. Robinson, in our stay here, we've been talking a lot about, I believe, the Bible study you're planning with Samson. And I don't want you to have to give away your Bible study too much at this point, but
Well, I could make a cleaner case for Rahab than Samson.
oh, sure. But I mean, Samson, I mean, you almost think like, what type of good things might he have been doing for Israel that just kind of got glossed over because
Right.
the story highlights every pretty girl that walked in front of him, and anyway, so sometimes with history, I mentioned the game Would You Rather. That's actually one of my kids' favorite, kind of car ride games is, to play, Would you rather, and a lot of times we're trying to choose between good things like, would you rather go to the feast in the mountains or on the beach, or something.
Right.
You play that, you get everybody's opinion on that, or if we're hungry, or whatever, would you rather have a hamburger or fried chicken or whatever it is. But sometimes you're almost looking at it just saying which is the worst one you don't want to be in. Almost like we've been saying about some of these examples in history. Would you rather be the Pole who's conquered by the Nazis or the communists? And you're like, well, neither, but since I don't have an option, maybe it's this. Or if the Germans are losing, would you rather be captured by the Americans and British, or would you rather be captured by the Soviets? Well, that was an easy answer, right? That was a very easy one for the Germans to say. We would far rather end this war in a POW camp under the Western powers than most likely just get butchered by, whichever Soviet army we run into first. And sometimes empires are like that too. This idea of, what would you rather, almost taking it back, because this is where I think the Bible gives us a very clear answer, but I'll ask you to, and I'm assuming we're all going to be in agreement on this. But like, would you rather have been a Jew or an Israelite, during the Assyrian Empire or during the Persian Empire?
It's a no-brainer. Persian.
Okay. See, you gave it. Mr. Robinson gave it away, and Mr. Smith was obligated to say Persian.
No, but I mean, absolutely. You even look. I mean, who sent them back?
Right.
Look at Cyrus. Look at
Yes.
I mean, unless you got a Haman coming around, to kind of mess things up. I mean, yeah, it was a blessing to be there.
Well, and you
in a way,
think of Assyria, just what the Bible says about it. Like I said, Jonah didn't even want to go there. Nahum is practically dancing in the streets that Nineveh is burning.
Right.
And then you get the Persians, and they just sound, more like, questionable bureaucrats. But it's kind of like, well, this king, he's even though they're still doing empire things, they're still doing things like in the Book of Esther, where it's like, hey, the king's kind of feeling lonely. He'd like to have a lot of young, cute girls come in here, and Esther gets roped into it, and everybody's kind of like, yeah, that's what the emperor does. He does stuff like this, but very different than our mindset today. But even then, they just kind of think, oh, okay, well, Persians do this, but hey, the Assyrians probably would have taken the girl and killed her family, so at least they're doing this. In the would you rather, the Bible clearly shows the Persian Empire to be, again, if you're grading on a curve, the more tolerant, the easier one to live in, especially as God's people. Mr. Robinson, did I cut you off there?
I was actually even thinking back to your original question, what you kind of answered this. The pole, okay?
Right.
If I had a giant circle closing in on me and it's equally made up of British, Russians, Spanish, and Mongols, who am I going to try to surrender to? You don't even have to think about it. I would
it's not
surrender
even a
to the
debate.
British. Yeah,
It'd be silly to even pretend to debate it.
And I would also add, I don't know if this is the best point for it, but I would even add, because even the United States gets kind of swept up into this a little bit, in this more modern thought about evaluating things and colonialism, which, the United States only dabbled in colonialism compared to the British. But again, what did even the Greeks and the Spartans and the Persians and everybody do after they conquered you? They subjugated you. What did the Western powers, primarily Britain, France, and the United States do, and especially the U.S. do at the end of World War II? Spent millions and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars rebuilding their enemies.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not only did we not, I know that you could say technically we occupied them for a time, but even Japan, we didn't occupy that long. And the Japanese, from what I understand historically, looked at MacArthur, I said McCarthy earlier today, was a benevolent leader until they were back on their feet and had their constitution, and then they self-ruled again.
Right.
And the Germans, same kind of thing, until they, a little bit different with them being half under the Russians and half under the West. But I mean, I challenge anybody to go find, not even anciently, historically, any empire, any conquering nation of any time who actually helped their enemies get back on their feet.
Well, and even the British, as they're running their empire, it's sort of interesting how, again, the idea of would you rather? Would you rather have been a citizen of the British Empire, even though you might not have had full rights, even though they did not get everything right, and occasionally made they had bad actors too. I mean, you're not going to get a nation of tens of millions of people without some real knuckleheads and people who lack character along the way. You are going to have plenty of those examples. But I did have a British professor at the University of Arkansas where I was getting my degree in history, and I was glad, looking back on it, I'm glad that he presented it in such just a factual way, because he was willing to present some of the good, bad, and ugly of the British Empire. But almost like we're saying today, critically good, that there was some of it. And yet, one of the things he pointed out was that the British Empire really did frequently believe that their job was to bring what they felt was civilization, their version of civilization, to other places. Now, did they get some things wrong? Sure, British culture is not perfect, but they were solving other problems. But one of the things that they really stressed was, again, the rule of law and that people should have a say in their government. And it's perhaps one of the best examples was Gandhi, who was even educated by the British. He received, part of the reason he was so successful was because of all of the benefits of him being in the British Empire at that time. Who knows what type of education or what type of future he would have had if the British had not been in India. But he gets all of this, and he actually takes British ideals, and the main thing he's doing is he's promoting Indian independence from the British Empire. And as he's doing that, he's frequently using the very British arguments against the British, and saying, well, look, you've been here long enough. We should be able to rule ourselves. You've let Canada and Australia and New Zealand, you've let other people start having more self-governance. You should be letting us do the same thing. And Gandhi, of course, famously was also kind of revolutionized the idea of a nonviolent protest, that he would try to find ways to do that. I think he was one that, in particular, he loved it when the British would try to impose a curfew, because you talk about the type of rule that you can oppose. You can break that rule and not be violent. We're so used to people storming the streets these days, but Gandhi would organize people just to be like, hey, we're going to break the curfew, but we're all just going to go sit in the public square or whatever and see what they do, force their hand, and sure enough, sometimes the British did not respond the best to that. But
well, what would the Assyrians have done?
But that's the thing, and that's the would you rather, because as my professor pointed out, he did not bring up the Assyrians, but he said part of the reason Gandhi was so effective is the British didn't really know what to do with him. They're sitting here like, well, he keeps griping at us and he keeps riling people up and he keeps breaking these laws, but he's not really damaging property, he's not really murdering anybody, and so let's throw him in jail. Okay, but let's let him back out, and they just didn't know what to do. But it's like, right. But as my history professor pointed out, well, who would have known what to do would have been like Stalin or Hitler. They would have just shot him, and that would have been it. He's some guy who ends up in a gulag or in a prison camp and is never heard from again. I mean, even to this day, I want to say there's like a Russian opposition leader who just kind of vanished here recently, and you're sort of like, okay, well, we'll see what happens
I read
there.
About that. He's at a Arctic prison now, which sounds very Russian.
Yes, and so even a guy like Gandhi, where he could point out some things the British had certainly messed up on, and again, that not everything they had done in India was perfect, but you can't imagine a Gandhi peacefully protesting the Assyrians.
Right.
I mean, you can't
or even
imagine.
the Romans.
Right. They just would have. I mean, maybe the Romans would have been okay because they would have been like, "Are you still paying your taxes? Then whatever you go, But like you said, I mean, you organize a break a curfew under the Romans. Well, they'd probably just send out the legion and just sort of clear you out of the streets. And much the same way the British did, which is again not perfect, but even in his very life, you almost see that. The British just didn't necessarily. They were not looking to just commit atrocities for the sake of atrocities. It's not to say they never did, and that there were certainly times that you can point those out. But like even one of the generals who was in India and went to he ended up ordering some of his soldiers to shoot into a crowd. It was just, it's just no way to defend what he did there, and it led to a stampede and a couple hundred people got killed. I mean, it was just really, really awful. Britain brought him back and fired him, I mean, it's like, they were like, what were you thinking, and they even with something that was an atrocity, they felt the need to actually try to clean it up. And it was part of the reason they were willing to, eventually even leave India in the first place, was that they were almost reflective enough to be able to say, are we actually doing any better? And of course, this is the hard part. Would you rather have been in India under British rule, where you could stand the chance of being one of a couple hundred people getting trampled in the streets, which is not good, and again, not defensible. But after the British pull out, India goes through like a civil war where about 500,000 people get killed in 6 months.
Wow.
As soon as the British are not there, the Hindus and the Muslim population just essentially ethnically cleanse the border area between what's now Pakistan and India. And 500,000 people who the British had managed to keep alive are suddenly not alive anymore. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, just a tail end that was that as Britain was pulling out, they even mentioned to people like, well, we're not really sure if we're doing it right or not, but if you want to move here, well, you've been our colony for so long, we'll grant you British citizenship. And like nearly 1 million people moved from India to England at that time. And so here's your question, your random history quiz question today. Do you know the national dish of Great Britain, of England today?
It's going to have curry.
Not quite, but you're not too far off.
Oh, really? What is it?
It's a chicken tikka masala.
Oh, really?
Chicken tikka masala. Yeah, which again shows the British element, because most of the Hindus were, vegetarian, so they threw the chicken in there. They're like, we're going to add some protein to this. But the tikka masala comes straight out of India.
Well, I was just going to add to your point. Mr. Smith and I did the podcast recently about Godzilla, but it's not about Godzilla. It was about the movie in which Godzilla made an appearance.
That's right. Some of the values that were surprising to find in what is normally shallow fare, right?
Well, again, because of that podcast series that I'd listened to, one of the things that I did not realize, because this just, I think, doesn't get talked about because there's a lot of history, and this is less important, by comparison historically, as far as most people would be concerned, compared to World War II. But Japan, when the U.S. fleet with Admiral Perry showed up, the Japanese realized that they were in danger of being colonized like they'd seen their other neighbors. And so they rapidly industrialized and so on. And so they avoided it. But what did they do? Did they go around making friends with the rest of their neighbors and protecting them? No, they said, we want to be colonizers too. I mean, the Russian Sino War? No, that's China and Russia. But anyway, Japan had invaded Russia. Japan invaded China. This is all before World War II.
Well, in Korea in particular.
In Korea, yeah. And so, to your point, when other nations had an opportunity to maybe do better after having seen colonization, they decided, no, we'll be colonizers as well.
Well, and one other point on this, maybe one other point on the idea that history is not fair and is graded on a curve, is that sometimes sometimes people want to portray the British Empire, or and to a degree any empire, as if they came in and they caused all the problems, rather than recognizing that there were already problems in all of these places anyway, because again, they were all human beings, all eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And sometimes we almost feel more content that it was like, well, we almost wish they were just warring with each other. We wish India had its 10 different kingdoms who were butchering each other for centuries, but the British show up, well, that's horrible. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, the British did some things wrong, but the people there weren't exactly, loving and God-fearing pacifists and everything before that. As you mentioned about the Aztecs, like when the Spanish show up, it's not like the Aztecs had been this glowing light of civilization and peace and tolerance or anything along those lines. As I've kind of debated about, or meditated, whatever. Well, why would the British win this? Why would a YouTube poll actually have this? And I think there's a couple things, and one that I'll be curious to see if you guys disagree or not. would you think that the British might have won that in large part because of how recent their empire was and also how successful it was? Because compared to like the Assyrians, smaller geographically and 3,000 years of memory allows us to forget a lot.
Thankfully, they preserve pictures of their conquest.
Yes. But I'm trying to think, like, why would people actually choose that? And I do think there's a good chance that since the British were so successful and in so many different places, there are a lot of places that do remember the negative things the British did in their area. And the Mongols might have been real bad, but they weren't in Australia. They weren't in South Africa. They weren't in Kenya. There's a lot of places that the British were in and in relatively recently. And so, anyway, any thoughts on that? Because that's a little bit more of a
in terms of
meditation
why
right,
there's such
like,
a tendency to do this,
or perhaps like what would be the reason that a person on YouTube,
right,
unless they're just trolling everybody and have tricked me into this entire topic, but unless why would nearly half the people actually what would be their rationale behind choosing the British Empire? To me, it might be proximity and
right.
success.
I think you're right. We found this is going to sound like an unrelated note, but we found, in fact, we just heard about some this morning in a manager's meeting about how much success we have with our Spanish YouTube channel for the telecast. We put out a short of Mr. Christian Rego was just talking about it, a short of Mr. Weston talking about how Christ was not born on December 25th. It's brief, it's short, and we have some pretty decent success. Our shorts do well for the English language, but that short in the Spanish language, 500,000 views. I mean, just absolutely huge. It's been a banner result for us. Well, that said, part of the benefit of that, a part of why we're able to achieve such things in the Spanish language is because there's less competition as well. There's the presence of Spanish language content on YouTube is just different, let alone the content that we kind of bring, versus in the English language market in the U.S., we're competing against a lot, so it's harder to get in people's way and to stay there. And I think same thing with YouTube. That's partially going to be a reflection of who is, like, I'd be very curious to know the demographics of that, because I suspect you'd be hearing not only from those who have been impacted in some way historically by the British Empire, but also those who are of cultures who are the current mindset is to teach them directly that the British Empire is bad. That is, those who, your second point was about how unfair the historical, quote unquote, or historical figures or empires can be treated, instead of actually grading them accurately, grading them on a curve, which sometimes, depending on who it is, it can be a very good curve or a very bad curve in your favor or not. It reminded me of an article, and your last point too, come across in the American Spectator. I'm not recommending the whole magazine in general. I'm not. It's not necessarily a magazine I read regularly, but it was from 2021. It really grabbed my attention, and I shared with Benjamin. My son Benjamin also has a history degree, and he seemed to like it. The title was "The Historical Falsification of Columbus's Crimes." And it goes into some depth about Christopher Columbus, because it was I think Columbus Day 2 years ago it came out, trying to highlight that right now he's kind of like the Darth Vader of history. We're changing the name Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, and there's this huge list. Like, well, he was clearly the most horrible human being. That the moment his sandal hit the shore here in the Americas, some smoke probably came curling around from the ground, like the devil himself had showed up. And I admit there's so many details. This article by Armando Simon, and his article has so many details of the reality of what doesn't get reported about Columbus's presence in the area. And among that, he in particular, he highlights, and Dr. Winnell would appreciate this, he highlights the challenge with the Howard Zinn book, A People's History of the United States, which is used in a lot of educational institutions here and there, at least from my research, and is very biased. I mean, Howard Zinn had he wanted you to think about America in a certain way. It was not about presenting the facts. It was about, I want the readers of my book to think about America in a particular way, and think about Columbus, for example, in a particular way. But the picture he paints is so much more detailed in his article. like what you're saying, it's easy to think, oh, things were so nice before colonizers showed up, and then suddenly everything got terrible and we're oppressed. Versus the very messy history, to go back to your first point, it really was. I literally saw on my Pinterest feed, I do confess to having a Pinterest account sometimes as a man. That seems strange, perhaps, but it's a way to hack my brain and save an image that I can move on, especially design-related things. But one email they sent me just this morning had multiple things, the same thing. It's like, why isn't this being taught in history books? And it was a map of North America with all these tribes so cleanly, like, oh, here's the nation of the Iroquois. Here's this nation. Like, this was a populated land with clear boundaries that just Europe ruined. And I want to say some time ago, I actually heard a person of Indian heritage respond to that and say, because that's a fiction. That's, you pick one moment in history and they weren't clean boundaries and they were constantly warring with each other. It was not like some land living in peace. You had the Europeans show up and they're better at warring than some of you guys are. So he himself was frustrated with that kind of depiction. And his article about Columbus points the same thing. He's pictured as virtually a demon in human form. But if you actually talk about it, it was a complicated land that he arrived in. And it's one they just came to slaughter, the locals. A lot of the locals were grateful because there were these other locals that were cannibalistic out of South America, and there were some other, and he actually helped, and he stopped some practices, and they felt that he was actually really, he was like I want to say savior, but definitely an ally. They appreciated it. He tried to put a halt to a variety of practices, but then his team is complicated too, because it's not like Europe was a monolith, because under him were various Spanish individuals here and there. There's one particular general who thought, well, I'm going to take advantage of the circumstance. So he actually does do terrible things. And then Columbus goes away and he comes back and then he calls that guy to account. It's like, wait a minute, this isn't right. And so nothing is clean, really. But the challenge is you can't communicate all that detail unless you're getting a history degree. And so you're so dependent on the individual to filter down the reality for you. And generally, reality is filtered through the mindset or the vision of the individual who has a particular agenda to sell. And so if you want Columbus to be the world's greatest explorer, and man, we just owe him so well, then that's how he's painted. If you wanted to be the world's greatest villain, like the first thing he did when he landed here was kick a puppy he saw on the beach, then that's the way he's pictured. Versus God's approach, which is with his heroes, we're not getting all the details of their life. Their lives were complicated, both his heroes and their villains. But you're getting the warts and all. You're getting the good. You're getting the bad. And God is great about just simply recording the facts. And it just seems history is so dependent on the point of view, so that you're generally going to get. It's too easy to say that it's always personal bias. The fact is, you're processing, because Benjamin took classes that you probably did in terms of, I can't remember what it's called, but the practice of writing history and how you do that.
Yeah, historiography.
Oh, there you go. That's a good term.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a challenge to actually boil down a historical event and try to be unbiased, etc. And even the best histories are still going to they have to choose what not to talk about.
Yes.
And so even when there's not an agenda, it's very difficult to do. Which, by the way, just time-wise, so you guys know, because I'm kind of the official timekeeper, we're at an hour. So we're just right there at about an hour.
Well, I have one more major point, and
I'd love to hear it. That sounds great.
Well, let me ask you, Mr. Sandor, how did a teeny tiny little island conquer a quarter of the world?
There you go.
Is it just British exceptionalism?
Right, and that's the question, right? Because I mean, if I'm correct, that a lot of people chose the British in large part because they were very, very successful. That they were actually an empire that the sun never set on. And you look at the map of the places they colonized in Africa and India, in North America, in Australia, New Zealand. I mean, you feel like you're going to be leaving so many places out. I mean, India and Iraq and the Middle East at one point were under them. It's an insanely large empire that they were able to conquer.
And no email, no downloading, no instant
right,
communications. I mean,
right.
It's phenomenal.
And not it to some degree, that is a fascinating history that we have no anywhere close to enough time to talk about. Because I think that's a great question, though, is the way Mr. Robinson just phrased it. Is it just because of their exceptionalism, or again, why talk about this to a bunch of kids in the church? Can we point to scriptures about this? And of course, that's what kind of takes us back to promises that were made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then specifically with Jacob blessing Ephraim and Manasseh. So in Genesis chapter 48, there's the account of where Jacob has called Joseph and his two sons in, and he crosses his hands to bless them. And this is Genesis 48, and after Joseph tries to get the hands on he wants the older one to get the major blessing.
Right.
And so
Manasseh's the older; he wants him to get the big blessings, but then God guides his hands across him.
And so after Joseph argues with his dad, Jacob's responding in verse 19, where he says, "But his father Jacob refused and said, 'I know, my son, I know. He, being Manasseh, also shall become a people, and he shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations.'" And this younger brother, being Ephraim, shall become a multitude of nations. And it's sort of interesting, as Mr. Robinson even tried to challenge about, what other empire. I remember when I first came into church and I read this verse, and it was presented that it was the British Empire, and I almost thought, wow, come on, and then it's the United States, and especially as an American, I sort of thought, it sort of felt a little self-serving without doing a lot of research. I was like, oh, we found the great people, and it's us, or whatever. And so I was kind of like, well, but you start going back through history and trying to think, well, who else could possibly have fulfilled this? Where else do you have brother nations that one is a great nation and the other is a great company of nations that could fulfill this type of promise and, again, imperfectly, but actually fulfill this to the degree that they did go out, they stopped some pretty awful practices going on, even ones that they were committing themselves, like slavery they eventually got rid of, which... slavery is just so common throughout history that, not that Britain and America had any excuse for it themselves, but they, most countries never stop it without an outside influence. And certainly when you take a look at what happened in World War I and World War II, and even the Cold War to a degree, like you talk about sort of the, I'm going to blank on the guy's name who described America as the arsenal of democracy.
Churchill?
I was about to say, I want to say Churchill, but I can't, I don't have that quote in front of me.
Check real quickly.
Okay. But, then you go into the very next chapter in Genesis chapter 49, and where Jacob is calling all of his sons to him. Oh, it'd be fun to talk about Reuben here too, because, you kind of talk of like how Britain got its empire, and a lot of times it was at the expense of Reuben, but that's, again, since we're at an hour, we'll leave that for your own personal study. Because history is the best subject to study. Again,
okay,
would you rather be in a history class or something boring
class?
like
Yeah,
I know.
I don't know,
That's the question.
But ironically, but Reuben, the French fighting with his brothers in World War I and World War
That's
II,
true. Yes.
against fundamentally the Assyrians,
Right. And I guess for me, I was almost thinking back to like the 1700s and Napoleonic, 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, and then on through Napoleon, where Britain was basically stripping away the colonies from France by and large. Not all of them, but certainly India and Canada and some of the other places. But once you get into chapter, this is Genesis 49, and you get down to verse 22, where it talks about Joseph is a fruitful bow by a well. His branches run over the wall. This idea of wealth, and that it does run over and even benefits, his neighbors. And as we've mentioned, did the Israelites get this perfectly? No. They received these blessings. They did share those blessings with other people. We were even talking about the Irish potato famine the other night, and about how Ireland right next door was just suffering, and Britain did not handle it perfectly, but they did try. And that's sometimes even the thing that's kind of shocking, is most times in history, like especially to a degree, your ancient enemy over there, the wild people on the next island over are starving. Well, there's a lot of people who probably would have been like,
die.
yeah, well, hey, this might work out well for us. And again, the British did not handle it perfectly. Ireland, in terms of its population, still hasn't recovered, but it's but generally speaking, Joseph, it's a country, again, that Mr. Robinson brought up, was willing to rebuild after World War II. Not just rebuild itself, but rebuild even some of the nations that fought against it. And so you have these promises given to Joseph that God started fulfilling, and Mr. John Gwynn in some of the booklets about America and Britain in prophecy really points out how around 1800, for a variety of prophecies that indicate that right around 1800 would be the time that God would start fulfilling those. And you certainly see that the explosion of the Industrial Revolution in the United States and in Britain, how those benefited those nations, and also brought a lot of wealth and prosperity to other places too. Not perfectly, but again, with the would you rather, would you rather have the Industrial Revolution in Britain or in Assyria? It's which one are you going to count on using that more effectively? We see Britain being a successful empire because God was fulfilling promises that he had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and it was their faith and their obedience that led to them being, having an empire that the sun never set on, not because of the exceptional nature of the carnal Israelite being any better than carnal from any other nation.
Right. By the way, Arsenal of Democracy.
Yes.
It's hard to pin down the exact origin, but Franklin Roosevelt was the one who really popularized that. So in fact, the Wikipedia article that I happened to come across talking about it, Churchill is nowhere even mentioned. So I felt way off base on that now.
Well,
but
we got leaders in World War II. We were in the right ballpark.
That's right. I appreciate what you said in terms of, like for instance, shocker, I'm an American. And I do like to think about, America being fantastic in a lot of different ways. I get teary-eyed with, you hear the, what's his name, Green, the Proud to be an American song. I can't remember that guy's name.
Lee Green?
Yeah, is it Lee Green? But no, I get sentimental of our national anthem. But I do get, sometimes it can be frustrating because I'm very sympathetic to, of course, I grew up in America, certain American ideals. And yet, what we do understand in the truth is that the vast source of our blessings isn't because somehow we are a more capable, inherently, biologically, if you will, people. And the same thing for the British. It's that it was time for the descendants of Abraham to begin receiving those blessings. The blessings on Abraham are unconditional, but you get to do you get to enjoy them, or does God have to take them away and then give them to a people later, later down? Because there is a certain condition on that regard. Because you can't be a sinful, rotten nation, and God say, "Well, I got to keep blessing them because I told Abraham." No, because Abraham's descendants, there'll be more of them. So that's what it moved on from ancient Israel, and it landed here, like you said, in the 1800s. Please do read Mr. John Gwynn's booklet if you don't know why that is the case. And it's easy to get caught up and think that it's because we're somehow a better people, and then you have the mask stripped away, and it's just not. There are values there, but even some of those values, when you look like where did they come from? How did we? Is it because we were brilliant enough to, or were those actually part of the blessings themselves that God did allow us to understand certain things that we're not smart enough to figure out? I always bring up the quote, and I need to look it up so I have it with me and know who it is, but it was a Japanese official of some sort, and it was quoted way back in our Global Church of God booklet on U.S. and Britain and prophecy, and he commented how it's clear that God is not fair because he has blessed the land of the United States with more national resources than almost any other people on the earth have had in such a small amount of space. And the boys and I watched this video on America. I think we have it on the livingyouth.org website. It's pretty far back. Why is America so OP, in terms of being overpowered? And one thing was its national system of rivers. There's just no place on earth that has a national system. And you don't think that's important until you realize before there were planes or trucks or anything, there were river systems, and how much of American wealth and self-defense was. And those are things that you can't just be, well, we're so smart.
Right.
We decided to create a continent that is resource rich and all. So much of that is just stuff that we could never have done. And in fact, it's almost like if we had not become a great people, what would have been wrong with us? How could you, giving these kind of blessings? And it's easy to forget that. But then part of why it makes it is so frustrating, because on one hand, we need to be careful about ideas like British exceptionalism. But then there's those who are trying to knock that these days because they're trying to teach the result of this poll. They're trying to say there was nothing good. Man, the last thing you want is to be conquered by the British people and be one of their subjects. When really, people are rich. I mean, I say people are rich. I mean, a nation can have a rich variety of thoughts. So you can have some who are under British rule, and man, I can't wait to just throw off our British oppressors. But then some others like, man, I am so grateful the British have finally fixed this and that, and be thankful. So it really is a mixed bag.
Yeah, in Deuteronomy 33, I'm not going to read it for sake of time, but like you said, from verses 13 to 17, where Moses is talking about Joseph, he does some of those exact same blessings. I mean, he just points out, almost like the way you described it there, like, you're going to happen to get the best land on the planet. But he never says, oh, Joseph, because your descendants are all going to be so righteous, because they're going to come up with a Bill of Rights or a Constitution. He's like, no, he's just like, this is going to be the blessing that God gives to you at the end of the age. But obviously then we know that with those blessings, comes responsibility. But I think the thing I would almost want to conclude with is that even when we take a look at the British Empire, even if I think can very clearly argue that it's not the worst empire in history.
I think that verdict is clear.
At the same time, like, it is going to be nothing compared to the kingdom of God. And that you could even take a group of people, give them the blessings of Joseph, that you could give them these blessings to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and especially these ones that are given to Joseph. But you have to have Jesus Christ in charge of it, because you still have atrocities. You still have warts. You still have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You still have some things that go on there that are just, again, inexcusable for the British or for the Americans to be doing, ways that they acted, maybe to kind of grab something that was said about King Saul, or they acted like all the nations around them, right? That they were acting just like everybody else in history to a degree. And that's part of the reason we don't look forward to, or we don't look backwards to being like, oh, if only we could go back to the British Empire, if only we could go back to this point in history. In some ways, that one of the main lessons is, all the more that even when a group of people is given all the material blessings they could ask for, even when they are using it somewhat helpfully to other people, you have to have Jesus Christ. You have to have the kingdom of God here to really have a truly and prosperous kingdom.
Smith and Robinson.